I think I can trace it back to being 8 years old and getting an allowance of 25 cents and knowing that 25 cents was the equivalent of 5 candy bars. So 5 cents has meant a lot to me from a very early age. And this is my best way to frame my unbecoming tendency toward being stingy. I've admitted this before, it hasn't helped. I continue to be that person who, as an example, it seems like I never these days have cash. And so if I find myself in a service, there's been a recent consecration. Yesterday we had the diocesan convention. And why don't I know this, right, going in, that there will be that moment when the plate's going to come by. And I'm like, oh, there must be a Venmo code, and I'll use that. And I never do. And so there's this gospel today, the widow's mite, could be said to address people like me, people perhaps like you as well. You don't have to be a Yankee to have trouble reaching for your checkbook. This, the conventional approach to this gospel is to say, don't be that rich cheapskate. Is that what you call it? Cheapskate. Don't be that guy, but be the one, because God favors those who have less, but are nevertheless generous. Generous often beyond their means. So take the message and be sure that you are the cheerful giver. And of course, this gospel, coincidentally, comes in the middle of our pledge campaign, right? So I know there are a lot of clergy who are playing that card right now. I'm not going to do that because I feel that that is coercive and joyless. And if we are going to give, it has to come from a different place. I also find within myself a reluctance, and this dates way back, a reluctance to jump in readily to anything that has to do with political/social justice issues. Now, as a priest, I'm super mindful and conscientious, and I have, twinges of compassion, like anybody, for the oppressed and the downtrodden. But there's something in me that avoids getting into a fight. And it seems to me that anything that comes up that has to do with social justice is someone's inviting you to a fight. And you got to take a side. And so this gospel could be read as a way of addressing the reluctance in me and perhaps the reluctance in you to get in there and fight for the downtrodden. So here's a widow who clearly has been beaten up. And this is Diana Butler Bass. She's a fellow clergy, and she wrote a piece on this. I made the mistake, of course, of reading it before this morning and thought, well, I'll just read her take on this, but I'm going to steal a little bit of it. She said, no, this wasn't some meek, mild, widow. This is an angry woman, and she wants justice because chances are she was married. She went with this scenario, Diana Butler Bass, that her husband died and left an estate. And that estate was, because she's a woman, overseen by a man, a lawyer, a scribe. And as Jesus is pointing out with no doubt great justification, don't trust those guys because they like to devour, the houses of widows. So this woman could well have had plenty of resource to live out her life as a widow. But you can see the scenario of how the one in charge of her estate just ran off with it. And what recourse does she have? None. So she's down to her last 2 pennies. And by God, she's not going to let them run off with those as well. So she holds on to those and comes into this public place and throws them into the treasury and said, well, take that, choke on that. Those are my last 2 pennies, and you're not going to have them. And I throw myself down on the mercy of Jesus or God, the ruler of justice. So if you read it that way, then you are you are invited, provoked, coerced to taking a side. Get on the side of that widow and take aim at all the powers that be that oppress people. And And I hear that, but I also find that to some degree coercive, and I find it also joyless. And I always believe and know it to be true, and it feels to me my responsibility as a preacher to find, the pony in the pile, right? To find the grace that is there in the Scripture. And so I look for the joy, the peace, the grace, and I'm not trying to be, as they say, Pollyanna with the filtered lenses, the rose-colored glasses, but can't we say that all of us, even if we don't know exactly what we mean by it, are searching for joy? I would say that joy requires an open heart, requires trust, that joy isn't just a feeling, it's a place that you can arrive at and you can move more deeply into, and that this gospel can also be described as addressing that need within us. That this woman, having been battered about most of her life, could easily have gone the route of the other widow that Doug described, who's gathering together those last few branches to go off and light a little fire and take her measly bit of bread and oil and put it together so she and her son can have their last meal and then die. That's someone who has, at that moment in time, shut down, been so beaten up. And there is no way any one of us ever gets through this life without arriving there. I'm not going to let that happen to me again. I'm shutting down. My brother Jeff, and I don't think he'd mind my referencing him, my late brother Jeff, one thing I knew about Jeff is he loved, like a good dog, loyalty. And if you treat a dog, you really have to treat a dog very badly for the dog to turn on you. But once they do, you never go back. And with my brother, there are a few people in his life that betrayed his trust. And they were marked people for the rest of life. He would not go back and ever give that person a second chance. And I respect that, but I also realize that if you take that approach, which we all are entitled to do, and you shut down and you say, I'm not going to trust, your joy, your opportunity, your God-given right to experience joy has been robbed from you. And so this woman who had every right to shut down keeps her heart open. And in that place, with trust, she comes in with her last 2 cents. And it's not that she's wanted to look good or she's being spiteful. This is her way of making sure that her heart remains open, and this is her way of stepping 1 degree closer into the relationship with divinity and with those around her, by the way. And in that place, in that relationship, which is a place that you can always go to and go deeper, that's where joy lies. And when you're in that place, you want to be generous. If your heart is open and you're trusting the people around you, it's not only comes sort of second nature, but if you're conscious of knowing what it feels like to be generous and how it solidifies and deepens and makes more inviolable. You know what it means to say sacrifice? I wanted to throw this in there. The word sacrifice, which I'm always a little hesitant to say, you guys should be a little more sacrificial with your giving. Sacrifice means literally make sacred, make holy, make inviolable, make permanent, make everlasting. So every time you make a sacrifice, you step away from something that you're holding on to, maybe because you've shut down. You don't trust anybody. So what do you trust? The things you can hang on to. Mammon versus you can't have two gods. This is my stuff. And sacrifice means I'm going to take a little of this that will perish regardless anyways, but while it's still with me, I could turn this like an alchemical, I can take what's perishing and turn it into something permanent. I can take what I value here and sacrifice a little of it, maybe my 2 last coins. And what happens when I do that? It creates something deeper and more enduring and more inviolable. It makes this relationship with God holy, sacred, all the more. I'm suddenly, from that one little selfless act, I have gone more deeply into a reality of joy that no one can touch and that will last forever and that I can taste right now. And no matter what happens around me, it can't be touched. So if you get to that place, so even your giving is no longer anything but a joyful act. And if you are a person who can embody that and pursue that, what better way to change the hearts and minds of the people who would otherwise be our enemy? You know, you can argue all you want. You can have all the right reasons, but if you can't touch the heart of the person you're trying to bring around to a more enlightened view of the world, and a person who might actually dare to let down their guard and stop fighting with you, but actually begin to mimic and resonate with your open, trusting heart, that's where social justice actually, in my mind, gets traction. And not by beating someone over the head. So this gospel for me is about this dear, amazing woman who refuses to be robbed of her joy, that refuses to be robbed of living this life, already having been hurt, you know. Love as though you've never been hurt before, you know. Second naivete, we all have innocence, we get crushed and we get defensive. Will we arrive at the second naivete? It's a beautiful expression, second naivete. Knowing you could be hurt and yet opening your heart anyways. That we do because no one has the power to take our joy away. And that joy, as I say, can be tasted, embodied, entered, enjoyed here and now, and no matter what's going on around us. No one can take that from us. And it's something we generously want to share.